Welcome to Community of Poets. I'll be your host, Anthony Sovak, and today I'm joined by poet and professor Steve Salmoni. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Anthony. Thank you.
So our last guest, Charles Alexander, who you know, told us that writing poetry is an intensely personal and emotional process, and that when he starts a poem, he always starts with love. He looks for love. He looks for those powerful emotions. Is this something that you agree with?
Wow. When I saw the interview with Charles, I was really struck by that, and that's a very Charles thing to say, and I was very moved by that too, and in a way, kind of wishing I could say the same. And
it's okay to disagree with it.
No. I mean, and I certainly agree, and I really admire Charles for having that intensity and courage. I don't know if I feel as connected to myself in that same kind of way. I don't know why or if that would be the first word that I would use. Though at times I probably would say that. I think maybe when I first started to write poetry, it was with that word in mind. And I once had a disastrous job interview where the person asked me, "What do you write about?" And I said, "Love." And he said, "Well, you know, do you have any love experience?" I think was the next question. I thought that was a weird thing to say.
Yeah.
And that also might be why I stopped using that as a phrase. But I think I start more from text. Actually, and more from, and that also might be, and we share this coming from the same graduate program, but from my experience doing criticism, doing reading and writing about language. And I did a long detour from starting as a poet and then going into this, critical study, doing writing about literature. And writing poetry took not a back seat, but sort of marginal seat to what I was doing. And when I came back to being able to write poetry as the main thing I was doing, it was difficult to connect to that earlier practice where it was a primary emotional, creative, romantic response. And I almost didn't know what to do anymore. I didn't know how to write and to act. And also because I was teaching 5 classes at Pima and always rushing around doing things. I don't think I had the time necessarily to be still, to have the emotion recollected in tranquility. Yeah. That in that Wordsworthian sense.
It makes me wonder. So you say you sort of have this more theoretical approach when you compose, and so when was the last time, or when was sort of a prominent time when you looked around yourself in the world and you said, "There's a poem here, right? And so I need to either capture said poem or sort of understand the poetry of this moment." If that's not too trite an expression.
Probably not since I was in my mid-20s. I mean, when I first started to write, it was from primary sensory experience. And living in San Francisco right out of college, I didn't have a job. I didn't know what I was doing. And I thought I'd sit down and read all the things I didn't read while I was in college. As I sit in coffee shops in the Haight-Ashbury where I was living and read my Dylan Thomas and read Wallace Stevens and read Whitman and read all these other things that I had gathered with me, and drink lots of coffee because that's all I could afford at the time, and get very, very wired and very, very sensorily overloaded on things. And it's a great walking city too, San Francisco, and that would flood my perceptual grid, I think, and everywhere there'd be poetry. And so that would be the time where I couldn't stop writing. My notebook and my eyes and my senses and my hands and my life, everything was all wired together. And that's how I felt maybe in love with the moment, and poetry was pouring out. I was also working as a landscaper. That was my job before I went back into academics, and something about hands in soil and dealing with plants, dealing with living material also was stimulative. So every time I would make a garden or plant something or work with a tree that seemed to
Very Thoreau, yeah.
very yeah. Well, you know, I went to college in New England, and when I was not reading my assigned classwork, I would be cutting classes, walking in the New England woods with Thoreau in one pocket and Whitman in the other pocket, and you know, trying to educate myself in that regard, maybe.
And those, I mean, and when we were talking historically, those poets are intensely romantic and intensely about that experience. But you said you sort of moved away from that.
When I, yeah, well, it's not that I ever moved away from it, but I think that practice got reinscribed into a different kind of reading and composing practice. I think there's only so far I could have gone with that sort of spontaneous creation. I think I just felt I had exhausted the ability to render imagery, and I wanted a more sophisticated way to juxtapose things. I wanted a more diverse, maybe a more diverse set of images, and also a more refined kind of sentence structure. One thing I actually realized after having done a dissertation, and my dissertation topic was Henry James, who is a master of turning sentences and really getting meticulously aware of moment-to-moment registering of consciousness, that I was good at writing sentences. And rather than thinking about poetry as a kind of, you know, spontaneous overflow of consciousness and overflow of sensory awareness, it could be a composed thing, or it could be a constructed thing, a made thing. And there's certainly a tradition in contemporary American poetry of poetry as a construction rather than as a kind of welling up of, you know, of pure creation. And so I think I started to turn towards that as a primary means of activity. So a sentence to a sentence. You know, how can I make a poem as Williams said, a machine, small or large, made of words.
Right. Well, and when we encounter these machines, right? And here I'm thinking of fish. You know, is there a text here, right? Is there a text in this class? You know, one of the ways when I try and talk and teaching online, this is probably one of my few times I actually get to talk to my students, is you encounter the words, right? And the text isn't there. It's not that you know, I'm thinking of both Whitman and Irving have these wonderful poems about books sitting useless in libraries because they don't ever encounter the reader. You know, to whoever you are now, holding me now in hand, right? Here is the poem. This is the moment of poetry. And can you talk a little bit about those moments of textual creation in the interpretive process?
I'm not sure I entirely, I just whacked my microphone, so that's going to sound terrible. I'm not sure I entirely understand the question.
So, which is to say, if this is true, and you can say it's not true, but if this is true, that the poem's what happens when the reader comes to the poem, how could you ever be wrong when you interpret a poem?
Well, actually, your question's interesting because you're displacing the focus, though, from, or the aesthetic question, from a frame of reference from the creator to the reader. And that's a very interesting move to make. And that also reframes the whole notion of aesthetics. Is it a matter of authorship or readership? And that's a whole different kind of discussion. and I mean, and it's a fair one to make. And I could talk about poetry as an author or as a reader, and maybe as a reader of one's own work. That's,
which, you know, I think is also, and part of my concern is that too, right? You know, because I think we all start, even you said we start with love, we start with that intense personal, but if you want to go beyond that, if you want to become a better poet, you still have to undergo the writing process of critical self-reflection, which is, difficult when you care so much about a thing,
One of my favorite poets is Paul Celan, the Romanian poet who wrote in German. And he has a idea about the encounter as a theme, or as a concept in his own life, and as a Jewish theme, and as a notion in poetry. And maybe that's a concept to be elevated for this convert. We're certainly encountering each other. Maybe it's the poem is what you encounter on the way to the poem, or the poem is what you encounter on the way to yourself as you're writing the poem. Language is what you you can refigure this or rearrange the pieces to make any kind of sense out of the different bits of that. I think reader, writer, text encounter each other in all these different configurations, and maybe self is what results from those procedures of encounter. I don't know if that's too bizarre to say.
I think I'm gonna transpose this in this moment of this, especially I'm gonna latch on this word encounter, and I'm gonna go to a poem that I think a lot of my students have trouble with. Stopping by woods on a snowy evening, right? It's about, there are so many encounters, right? Especially as this speaker encounters these empty woods, right? But he's also encountering these other sort of societal responsibilities. And I feel like this is a ripe poem that's often, and here I feel like I might be using a word that you'll disagree with, but is also often misinterpreted. I get a lot of, oh, he's Santa Claus, right? And he's on his way to Christmas. And, while Dan Chasen once told me, there's no poetry decoder ring, right? And that, there's no, it's not about finding hidden meaning. On the other hand, I do think that, there are ways that we can sort of miss the mark, and we can talk about what isn't in the poem instead of what is in the poem. And so when we start talking about what isn't there, we sometimes, not always, but we sometimes keep talking about what isn't there until we're so far removed from what is actually there. And so I guess sort of to repeat the question, but can you be wrong? Can you miss it? Or how do you know when you've got it right?
Yeah, well, that's Fish's question about the limits of interpretation, right? Can you, and I think the example he uses is Blake's poem, The Tiger, Tiger, Tiger Burning Bright. And I think one example is Blake had some terrible spicy food the night before, and he wrote the poem about his indigestion. And that's one possible, maybe we'll find some secret letter that Blake wrote where he has a journal entry. Oh yeah, I had some really bad food, and then that would legitimize that kind of interpretation. But until we find that document, that kind of interpretation would be nutty, or would be really, really far out.
Right.
Unless you're doing kind of gastronomic Blake, which maybe somebody could do. And I think what Fish's idea is that there are different kinds of interpretive communities and different kinds of cultural assumptions and standards that set these limits, and those change over time. And certain things historically or socially or within certain kinds of formations legitimize and set these boundaries. So it could be a time, if we ever discover extraterrestrial life, that's an example I always use in class, where right now, if we have alien readings of literature, that would probably be time to call the therapists, But if we ever, in some distant future, discover this, well, okay, then those readings maybe suddenly become, not so off the charts.
What sort of what sort of activities do you do, or do you recommend for your students to make sure that at least initially, as they're learning to read the poem, they ground themselves in those sorts of scholarly or acceptable interpretive community?
That's a good question.
And in part, also I'm thinking, the more you read the poem, the more you get out of the poem,
sure,
right?
Sure.
And so every time you come back, you find something new, and you want to try and, get to the point where you could say, all right, well, I understand this well enough. I'm sure if I keep reading it and alongside other works, I'll get more out of it. But for right now, I know it's not about indigestion or Santa Claus.
But in my 205 poetry class, I'm not sure I always try to impose those limits, because at times I'm trying to liberate creativity to spin as wildly, and again, that sometimes is, am I teaching people to read as readers or read as writers? And there are times where I want actually them to bring something completely off the wall to a reading, because it seems that in the moment of our conversation that it's doing something for their own creative process, and they're reading another student's poem and really misreading it on their own terms, on the terms of the poem, but relative to what this other student I know is doing for their own poetics, it's really cool and really necessary for them to be taking it in that direction. So I've tried to balance two different students' needs at the same time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So yes, we're misreading this particular poem. So and I'll say that, well, yeah, this maybe doesn't work for this poem, but whatever you're doing at this moment to bring in this, tiger, tiger, burning bright, this is a heartburn. Yeah, go ahead and run with that. Yeah. That's really good. In a class like Writing 102, I really insist that we do scholarly research within peer-reviewed sources, and we do lots and lots of, editing and revision and careful limiting of our secondary work to things that are, by definition, going to have that community, have that integrity. Wikipedia is not necessary, or the kind of free-range internet searches. I caution them against that, because obviously.
Right, and again, it's all about which community, which interpretive community you're in. The evidence that's going to work for the paper in 102 is not going to be the evidence that convinces anybody of anything on Facebook, and vice versa.
Exactly. Yeah.
So,
and I'll admit to you that maybe I'm at a point where I'm a dinosaur, and Facebook maybe is the more appropriate. I'm not ready to really admit that yet, but there are burgeoning interpretive communities that will form in this next hour, even, or this next year, or the next decade, that will take on a life that will transcend my ability to understand them. Video game. You talk very beautifully about video gaming. And how that's a platform for interpretation and thinking and reading. And the last game I played was probably Space Invaders. Yeah. That escapes me as something I can really comprehend. But I grant you the fact
I do think that there's that we talked about when the reader becomes the writer, and there's sort of that space, and that was, I think, something that Roger Ebert couldn't grasp when he said, video games can never be art, right? Because he was too much on the author's side. Right. I think he ultimately, the entire internet exploded on him. Right. And so he ultimately, sort of walked back from that statement. But there's that, when you're in the game, you are in the process of creating what is the art to you, right? Or what is the story? Yeah.
It's pure encounter.
Right. But thankfully for you, dinosaurs can still write poems. And I've asked you to bring some of your work, and I'm hoping that you will share some of it with us.
Oh, I'd be delighted
we can talk a little bit about that for a little bit.
Of course. Now or?
Oh yeah.
Oh, sure, absolutely. I'll say one of my students wrote a beautiful story in which I think I or a character playing me encountered a dinosaur and came to a very bad end. So it was a beautiful story. So, should I go ahead and
read I mean, if you would like to tell us a little bit about sort of the how and the why, that's
of course.
Amazing. Or you can just dive right in.
Now that I think about it, maybe these pieces that I'll read are hearkening back to the idea of encounter, or the idea of things that are brought together. I don't know if I write necessarily with a subject matter in mind, or again, these are sentences that just accrue and then the idea emerges. But these are a series of prose poems that I've been working on, and the word that seemed to galvanize them, or that to organize them, is the word proximities, which is a word that I love, and I realize it's also a word that my friend Eric McGrain uses for his wonderful online journal, which is a great source that bridges geography and poetics. He's a student in the geography program at U of A, but he's doing great stuff that brings together poetics and geography. And so, with all apologies to Eric, but this is a series called Notes for a Theory of Proximities. And how much time should I read? Just a couple, or?
Well,
yeah.
you know, let's get started. And
Okay. Well, I'll read the first one. It goes like this. A window's weather the hour long, if the hour is to be overlapping weather. A precision in letting hour see to hour. This dependency made the want of it apparent. In the hour of disbranching, it was impossible to clarify the arbor. Light must be a window's weather overlapping weather. What depends upon your judgment depends upon what height the air exceeds. The simplest form is set. The precision in the hour made the want of it apparent. We set sail on the hour and raised a larger sail upon our eclipse of the harbor. An interval that makes the interval between the hours belong, if the hour is to be the hour that it should. So I'll read that one. And one more. Bliss was made of boxes. But what does not change, not the predilection of designs, nor their division, nor the measure that would yield the term which, thus changed, would give itself to desire for its term. Everywhere, you say, you'd want history to find its current. Did I first want to say that a sea of gray circles would suggest nothing other than a letter? Imagine the sheer difference the sound impressed upon its evidence. Interior and interior in time, and lake, a threefold image of the binding of the day before. The null set is one's own findings, set upon one's findings, whereas the picture folds the lake to find some fold in continuity. Unbroken sea marks the line with letters to answer these.
we have a little more time, so we can read some more. But one thing that I want to sort of just, I don't know, remark on, right? You know, so we see in these two poems, I think I have a better sense, at least, of what you mean when you say the text, right? Because not only textually you're repeating the shore, right? You know, but there's also a lot of these double meanings, right? You know, under the sea, right? But you could be talking about the letter, or you could be talking about
very much so.
Which, you know, I always appreciate, and it makes it difficult, at least for me, in the initial reading, to get a sense of the whole pie, the whole poem pie.
P.I.
Right. You know, but initially I'm thinking of the last poem when you're talking of the lake, right? You know, and one of the things that I mean when I say, you know, the more poems you read, the more you can appreciate every poem. I'm thinking of Wordsworth's simile for autobiography, right? You know, and so he's in this boat and he's moving across the lake, and he looks down and he sees his reflection, but he also sees past the reflection, and he sees the things under it, you know. And so the simile, of course, being there, that, you know, when you look into yourself, when you write about yourself, it's you see yourself, but it's distorted, and it's always, you know, the things that you're recalling are always at the bottom, and they're not quite as you know as you experience them because they're in the depths of your memory. Right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, immediately here I am. You know, this is the child of that poem, right? And so that's where I would start.
Yeah.
You know, pragmatically when I started to read yours.
I'm glad you say that because I've been accused by my mother and other people who have read this. Well, these are very cold and objective poems, and you know, where's yourself in them? And I think they're very warm. I personally, but I'm not writing first person necessarily, but I'm not necessarily really concerned with writing first person. But I would agree that they're reflective and they're autobiographical in some genetic sense. That they're records of perceptions or records of perceptions. How perceptions and memories get inscribed in language. And I'm glad you picked up on the idea of letters. One of the I'm not quite sure how to handle this yet in language, but I'm really interested in letters. I've been from hanging around Charles's studio, but I love the idea of print and individual letters inscribed upon a page and how they can be scrambled and reworked, and even the way in which different words in a poem can be reworked and redone and reimagined, and then across a series.
Yeah, and you remind me, of course, that there's more, you know, when you do prose poems, you know, sometimes I'll, you know, have the assignment in my class, let's do a prose poem, and I will get back, you know, clunky paragraphs, and I say, well, it's still a poem, right? Like, I get that it's prose, but it's still a poem, and you know, you're reminding, you know, our viewers that, you know, you can still get that repetition. You can still, those letters, I mean, in the second poem, the bees, you start off with the bees, right? You know, or you know, the repetition of the words, right? You know, it's still a poem, and you want to make sure that it has those poetic elements.
Every sentence is carefully measured and measurable, and there's a push and pull. If you change one bit, everything else in the composition. I think of them maybe as canvases, or as, you know, or maybe as several, those medieval triptychs. This first one has 3 panels, and so each panel has its own composition, and then all 3 of them together are working as a kind of fold out, and so you work with each individual panel, and you change something here, the other 2 have to balance out, and they sort of unfold to create this dimensionality.
So it's prose, it's poetry, but it's also a picture.
Well, I mean, you know, I think about all the arts as working simultaneously through each other.
Yeah.
It's architecture, it's dance. I can't do many of the other arts. I can play music.
Speaking of James, it's a portrait of a poem.
Well, very much so, yeah.
I think that's about all the time that we have, and I want to thank you again for being here, for sharing your poems with us.
It's my pleasure.
Waxing philosophical.
I wish we had 2 more hours. This seems like it's the start of, a whole series of this. Invite me back.
Thank you very much.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you.